of work. The exhaustion of the workforce has got more than one element to it, by the way, and some of this Marx does also discuss. But basically workers in Latin America, for example, die on average about 20 years younger than workers in Western Europe. So the exhaustion of the workforce has got a weekly element, but it's also changes what are assumed to be the biological parameters of a human life. So basically, workers die younger because they worked to death harder. And this reaches its extremes with enslavement and other forms of colonial labor as well. So the other part of superexploitation, it relates to the training and education of the worker as well. And you can even think of other dimensions, and I'm not sure if Marini goes into this, but I'm sure he would not have a problem with it, which is things like bullying, lack of health and safety, informal contract or lack of contract, I should say, and so on. These are all characteristics of labor conditions in Latin America and elsewhere in the oppressed part of the world. Okay, superexploitation is produced when the labor force is paid below the necessary level for its own reproduction. Now, here's the crucial point which distinguishes it from relative surplus value and absolute surplus value, is there is a restriction in the consumption of use values. In other words, the workers are in real terms poorer. They get to eat and less, they live in worse houses, they have less money to buy stuff. So this is an increased exploitation both qualitatively and quantitatively. Marini's historical framing of this is the mid-19th century. He's saying, well, Marx writes about relative surplus value in Britain, especially in the middle of the 19th century, where modern industry takes off, a huge emphasis on relative surplus value. And he says, well, yeah, but these cheap commodities weren't just due to higher productivity of labor in England, they're also due to superexploitation of workers in Latin America. So Latin America, by the mid to late 19th century, was sending a lot of exports to Europe, and the capital which was sending them was superexploiting its own workforce in order to provide cheap food and cheap raw materials into the British and European market. But as soon as you take this idea, you can definitely think of it in an earlier period of history for sure. All the way through CapVol Volume 1, cotton appears more or less as a given. So who produced it, under what conditions, what labor, how do we conceptualize the production of enslaved labor into the capitalist commodity chain of cotton? So the examples of labor superexploitation, extending from Marini's contribution, you can definitely think of enslaved labor in the Americas, African labor, really obvious examples of gold miners in South Africa, but also many forms of colonized labor subjugated by colonial conditions, such as in India, neo-colonial type conditions, such as Chinese workers in Foxconn today, conditions of immigrant workers, such as strawberry pickers in Kent today. So in general, we can say these are workers which are being obliged, forced through state coercion and different relations of production as well, and social reproduction, to have to work under more oppressive conditions, under subjugated, colonized or neo-colonial labor conditions. So now just coming back to how we conceptualize this using the categories that Marx has left us in CapVol. He actually gives loads of examples of more acute exploitation. I mean, he draws mostly on conditions in England at the time. So if you look at chapter 10 of volume 1, you'll find a lot of references to child labor. Also later on, chapter 15, also women get paid less for basically doing the same work. And in the general law of accumulation, he contrasts the conditions in Ireland with the conditions in England. So what you can see is lots of examples, but I think it's fair to say that he doesn't really theorize this. And he argues at certain key points that he won't theorize this until he looks at competition. So this is, I think, quite anomalous in Marx, actually, because probably the greatest anomaly in his whole work, because he does look at competition. As we've seen, relative surplus value is actually arises or is imposed on capitals through the mechanism of competition. That's competition between capitals. And he also clearly got a sense of competition when you look at the general law of accumulation. He's looking at the competition on a social scale between capital as a class and labor as a class, right? So the competition that he doesn't look at is competition within the working class itself. And of course, this has got to be part of the construction of a theory of how wages go below the value of labor power. There's another point here, which is, are we talking about the reduction of the value of labor power, or are we talking about wages as the price of labor power, which go below its value? I mean, this can get a bit semantic, but I do think there is a distinction there to be made, and it does depend on context. Are we talking about an episodic movement, say, within the industrial cycle, or are we talking about structural and nationally or internationally structured differences, as under colonialism, most obviously, where these differences become normalized and they are structural inequalities, which are then get reproduced as supposedly different values of labor power between one country and another. Well, all that is a normalization of inequality. What is the value of labor power? That's commodities consumed in its reproduction. Marx is also quite ambiguous about this. Is quite surprising. If you go back to the text, you'll find quite a lot of places where he mixes up the definition with a slightly more general definition of subsistence, what is required to reproduce the labor and so on. When it comes to it, he's got quite a specific definition, which is the value of the commodities consumed in labor power's reproduction. Now, what that leaves unsaid is what about the labor spent in converting those commodities into actual labor power, of course, and this, of course, is the area of caring labor, the cooking, the cleaning, the housekeeping, the child caring, and so on, which is the terrain of the oppression of women within the capitalist mode of production. So basically, it's only implied rather than explicitly analysed in Marx, which is the gendered domestic labour and its role in social reproduction. And as I already mentioned, cotton producers, within his historical time, absolutely the most oppressed and exploited section of the labour force. And so what you've got is a strong indicator that what we have is a broader category than Marx directly theorized. In general terms, we're talking about oppressed and subjugated labor. And so superexploitation is both a social condition and an economic result. There are three positions. This is quite hotly debated in Latin America, and the debate has moved here into the English-speaking world. The first position corresponds actually to orthodox Marxism, what we would call Eurocentric Marxism now, which is that labor superexploitation doesn't have a theory in capital, and moreover, it's not needed. And those like us who argue it is needed just misunderstand that the level of abstraction of capital means that it doesn't deal with such things. There's a second position, which is that there is already in capital various aspects of superexploitation. So isn't that enough? I have more time for this position, but I think it's still wrong, because I think that actually labor superexploitation isn't only about particular regions or particular countries or particular groups of workers. It's part of the definition of the capitalist mode of production as a whole, which is the third position. So if you agree that labor superexploitation is endemic and essential to the capitalist mode of production as a whole, then you have to ask the question, where does it fit in the theory? And my argument is that specifically we need to amend both the concept of surplus value and Marx's volume 3 concept of prices of production in order to include labour superexploitation. So if you remember the ABC lines that I was referring to earlier from Marx, under labour superexploitation, it requires another category of surplus value, which is at the same level of significance and essentiality, if you like, same ontological level as absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. So with labour superexploitation, there is an increase in the rate of surplus value because variable capital is less. Now, in that